Here's another episode of What It's Like to Go to War. And on this one, I want to do part 2 of the value behind basic training, or the initial training that somebody goes through boot camp for the U.S. Marine Corps. In the first video, last time, I talked about the transition from being a citizen to becoming a warrior and living for something bigger and more important than yourself. And I don't want to go back over the details of the first video, but there is a second and probably equally important reason for this initial combat training, called basic training or boot camp or whatever it's referred to in your country. And the second training is taking the thought out of basic actions on the battlefield. Notice in the United States Army, it's called basic training. It's the basics that every warrior needs to know before they go off to combat. But I also want you to notice that it's training, the basics of training. And what the attempt to do here is to teach the very basic fundamentals of what it means to be able to function as a fighting force in combat. The day in and day out, all day long, brutal repetition in basic training itself can be terrible. Listen, there's a lot of things that are just no fun about boot camp or basic training. Being away from your family and the environment, and drill instructors shouting in your face all day long, and the stress of being in a uniform with a shaved head, sleeping in the dirt. All of those things are conditioning you to be able to function on the battlefield. But there are some basic military training that happens in boot camp or basic training that's essential for survival on the battlefield. And I don't want you to ever take these things for granted. So there's a story that's written in a famous book called The Battle of Mandalay, and it's about the Nepalese Gurkhas. Now, I've had a chance to see military forces all over the world. There are few forces on the planet that I respect more than the Gurkhas from the country of Nepal. In fact, my buddy Ranjit Thapa, if you're watching this, you and your countrymen are amazing warriors. In this story, in this book, it describes basic training, and it describes how machine gun teams are trained in basic training to get them ready to go to war. And then as the Gurkhas were sent on the battlefield in World War II to go fight against the Japanese in Mandalay, it's describing how this machine gun team, fresh out of basic training, goes to war. They have really not ever fought with each other. They've just been trained together and trained really, really well together. And in an initial firefight, that machine gun team takes intense gunfire, and the machine gunner is shot in the head and dies within a matter of seconds of taking a bullet in the head. While that machine gunner is dying, he intentionally, deliberately rolls off of the machine gun and pulls his hand off of the trigger and spends his last breath rolling away from the machine gun and taking his hand off of the trigger. And the reason why this is pointed out in this book is because this action has been trained so many times into the Nepalese Gurkha machine gun teams that as soon as a machine gunner is hit, he rolls off the gun, takes his hand off the trigger, because the assistant gunner right next to him can roll right onto the gun and put their hand right on the trigger. And literally with a couple of seconds of life left and every ounce of energy this Gurkha warrior had, he transitioned himself off of the gun so his machine gunner or his assistant gunner could transition onto the gun, and so that there was no disruption in gunfire. His last act on earth was to do what had been trained into him in basic over and over and over again. And as a result, the rest of his buddies on that machine gun team survived after he took a round in the head. I'm using this story to illustrate the incredible value of basic training. See, what basic training does is it conditions inside a warrior reflexes that you don't even have to think about on the battlefield. If you've been through some form of initial training, boot camp, basic training, some kind of commissioning source, don't take that initial training for granted, because it may be the very thing that you, when all other factors in your life are at odds and you're overwhelmed, the things that were trained in you to the point that they were just a conditioned response, those things may be the thing that saves your life, or in the case of this Nepalese Gurkha machine gun team, saves the lives of the people around you. This is one of the values of basic training. And in my opinion, the military owes the nation that it serves the toughest and the most realistic basic training that it can possibly provide, because the training that is conditioned inside of you in basic or boot camp might be the thing that saves your life or saves the lives of people around you. This is just a few thoughts about what it's like to prepare for war on this clip. See you next time.